I would like to introduce you to our next speaker.
Thank you.
The title of her talk is, can I have your attention, please? The title of her talk is The Role of Plants in Knowledge Production, Collaborators or Objects of Study. Her name is Laura Devon. She's a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. And she has also an MS in ecology from Colorado State University. She's currently doing a long-term field work in Peru with Peruvian ayahuasca shamanism, and looking forward to hearing her. Thanks.
Thanks, Bia. So when I was preparing for this talk, after a lot of abstract reasoning, I was rereading a quote from one of the speakers, Ushao Yuwanawa, at the Second World Ayahuasca Conference, whose sentiments were echoed many times, that we need to be humble when approaching these plant beings. And I realized I needed to get real if I'm to speak about plant agencies to all of you. So that night, I reached into that place in myself where I meet these plants, and I invited them to speak. I sang them some songs, and I asked them for a dream. I remembered what they'd asked me before, to share this with you, what I am now, that I'd bothered to ask them at all. When researching sacred teacher plants, we need to remember that we're encountering other beings, which is something that makes these plant medicines special. And I'm not saying that there's no spirit to manufactured substances, because everything is inspirited, but perhaps some spirits are older, for whatever that's worth, and many are so old that their stories go back to the very creation of their peoples. For example, according to Elder Silva, a Hunikuin man, God gave us ayahuasca the moment he placed us on the earth. These stories are told by people, and they're also told by plants to people, and so they're co-created. Their animacy makes these plant beings special, but it also makes them difficult to study in a way that keeps their animacy intact. This is a problem not only limited to the study of plants, but also in studying people. And it's a problem for all of us, because if we limit our knowings to an inanimate world, then we seem to lose touch with our own humanity. Social scientists and anthropologists have grappled with this question for a long time, of how to account for the agency and animacy and subjectivity of the supposed object of study, when one is supposed to be the knower and the other the known. It's something that may require disrupting some hierarchies of knowledge, power, and animacy. Whereas I define agency as the capacity to act and influence, I also use the word animacy to refer to a measure of perceived relative liveliness that I get from Mel Chen. Shown here is an example of what an animacy hierarchy might look like, with white males maybe being near the top, and plants maybe being somewhere near the bottom in the non-animal area. Disrupting these hierarchies might mean unseating ourselves from a position of being a privileged knower, and fundamentally questions human supremacy and separation from nature. This requires humility. It requires meeting the other subject at our limits of knowing and acknowledging that we can't circumscribe them in our own minds or with our usual methods of knowing and scientific practices. At best, we can only have a partial perspective on the other. But is objectification necessary for knowledge production? The worlds of these powerful psychoactive plant medicines open us up to alternate ways of knowing and producing knowledge. However, there seems to be a discrepancy between researchers' intersubjective relationship with plants and the methods they use to produce knowledge about them, including my own. So here I'm exploring how the assumptions inherent in research methods privilege certain types of knowledge and how academia privileges certain types of methods, resulting in a reproduction of hegemonic knowledges. And I argue that it's necessary to interrogate our methods and our assumptions. So the main explorations for my talk are what assumptions do researchers make about plants and knowledge, and how do these assumptions determine the types of knowledge that are able to be produced? And secondly, how can we acknowledge agencies other than human in knowledge production processes and incorporate multi-species perspectives into our research? I draw on 61 presentations from the Second World Ayahuasca Conference that took place in Rio Branco, Brazil in October and was organized by some of the same folks like Bia here. This conference was multidisciplinary and multicultural with a strong Indigenous representation. All the participants were brought together by interest in ayahuasca. I also draw on what I've learned during my ethnographic work in Shipibo communities in the Ucayali region of Peru, where I've been learning a lot from my teachers, both plant and human, including how to learn from plants. And I just wanted to take a moment to express gratitude for those teachers. So why are multi-species perspectives important when studying ayahuasca? The problem is that it's hard to study plant agencies or take them into account. But nonetheless, plants are agents in producing knowledge and meaning, not just objects to be studied. They do not just receive their significance from humans. They have their own knowledge about their worlds that we can never truly know, but by being with them, we can learn things not otherwise available to us. Plants desire, seek nourishment, and have their own form of language. Plant communication is especially trans-species, and they're able to express themselves through chemicals, for example, producing different chemical scents in response to insect predation. And particularly when we're speaking of psychoactive plants, our bodies are able to read these expressions and translate them into human language. Whether we're using our bodies, science, or other knowledge-making practices, part of the other exists beyond knowability, and this other is active in the process of generating knowledge. This acknowledgement alone piques curiosity, invites relating, and grants agency to other beings. What will they reveal to our methods of questioning? How do they wish to be known? Secondly, when we allow other species to collaborate in the construction of knowledge, and not just the construction of the world as a backdrop to human activities, we open ourselves up to multiple worlds and expand the realm of the knowable. Excluding these other agencies leaves us with impoverished accounts of the world. This is also a cross-cultural issue, and we're speaking of plants that have many meanings, many names, and many stories. Some indigenous sciences have been more successful at accounting for plant agency and communicating with plant beings. Indigenous sciences from the Amazon include traditional and formal ways for connecting with and communicating with these plants, as well as decolonial indigenous ways of practicing Western science. These practices are heterogeneous and differ among and within peoples. For example, for the Shipibo healers that I've been working with, the system of dieting plants is the main method by which they learn from teacher plant spirits. And the general idea with this is that by making the body a very quiet and empty place and engaging through dreams and visions, the healer learns to communicate with and personify the plant spirit. This is a method for accessing the knowledge the plant spirit possesses. They are then able to use that knowledge for healing. Note that this is distinct from knowledge about the plant. Healing and communication with other plant spirits is often aided by ayahuasca. The plants used to make the ayahuasca tea, Kapi and Chacruna generally, are master plants which facilitate communication with other plants. So part of this conversation needs to be about how to include indigenous ways of knowing in a manner that's not furthering the colonial project of cultural appropriation, nor ignoring or excluding these ways of knowing from what are considered valid knowledge-making practices. I'm wondering how we can work with indigenous epistemologies to transform our research methods and practices so that they're not complicit in recreating hegemonic knowledge systems. As Anishinaabe scholar Sonia Adelaide says, we need to braid knowledges together to create a better and more complete kind of science. Perhaps at the heart of these conflicts is an ontological tension about what exactly these plants are. And by ontology, I mean assumptions about the nature of reality, or what exists. Epistemology, on the other hand, which I'll discuss later, is how we understand the world and communicate knowledge. And this is important because, as Werner Heisenberg wrote, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. I've assembled here a word cloud from statements made at the World Ayahuasca Conference about the nature of ayahuasca. The conception of ayahuasca and how people spoke about it were very diverse, including as a creator or a mother, as sacred, as a chemical complex, harmaline plus DMT, or simply as an experience or drug. And this is not differentiating between indigenous ontologies and Western ontologies because they did not shake out on a clear divide. All of these understandings are truth statements, even if some of them can seem more complementary to another and some more antagonistic. This concept is similar to this illustration here, where the truth presents itself differently, depending on the position of the observing subject. This is what feminist scholar Donna Haraway calls situated knowledge. However, our perspective on this image here implies that from our privileged position out here, we actually know what the truth is, that it's a cylinder. This myth of objectivity is what Haraway refers to as the God trick, in which there is a misconception that we can stand nowhere and know everything. Our perspectives and our ontological understandings should determine epistemology, our methods, and what we're able to describe. So, again, epistemological assumptions are those about the grounds of knowledge, how we understand the world and communicate knowledge. These include ideas about what forms of knowledge can be obtained as well as determinate, and how we decide what's true and what's false. And even the dichotomy of true and false applies in epistemological stance. For example, right now, I'm generally coming from a constructionist epistemology in which meaning is not discovered but constructed out of practices. This allows me to examine conditions that cause certain knowledge claims and to treat knowledge claims equally. I can also reflexively apply these methods to myself. So the following I'm going to discuss are 4 types of epistemological frameworks, the somewhat simplified version of what most of the speakers at the World Ayahuasca Conference were using. The first is an interpretivist or constructionist epistemology that seeks to understand how meaning is constructed, understand other people's ways of making meaning of their own experience, and focuses on subjective meaning, social phenomena, and details. The first category of research that I placed in this was psychotherapeutic studies, which understand ayahuasca through people's experiences. And also in this framework are ethnographic studies, which understand ayahuasca through human cultural knowledges, beliefs, and governance. The second epistemological framework is positivism or objectivism, where meaning and meaningful reality exist apart from the knower. It relies on the existence of a fundamental divide between the subject and object of knowing, which leads us to see reality as an object. And it assumes that valid knowledge should be objective, reproducible, and measurable, with the goal to create knowledge that exists independent from our own subjective interpretations and provide a unified account of reality. In this framework, there are medical and pharmacological studies that understand ayahuasca through physical measurable responses in humans to the brew, and ecological or botanical studies that understand ayahuasca through measurable plant behaviors and interactions or physical chemical properties of the plants. And then the third framework is relational or social, where meaning is made through intersubjective relations. Reality and knowledge are constructed relationally. The first category I put in this is learning communities or community-based participatory research, in which knowledge is made of dynamic relational networks and practices. The community is not just seen as a source of knowledge, but as active participants. And the community sets the agenda, helps the community develop research questions. A researcher helps develop research questions, document and analyze, and the data and results are co-produced. And then also in this category, I put shamanic ways of knowing, which are also relational and generally understand ayahuasca through direct communication and relationships with plants and or spirits. For example, Shipibo healing rituals offer a methodological way of entering into direct reciprocal contact with plant spirits and other than human beings, confusing the boundaries between human and plant, self and other, blurring hierarchies of animacy, and bridging material and spirit realms. These plant beings are then included in the social processes of the formation of the self. This stance encourages us to meet at or past the edge of our knowing. And finally, there's pluralism and a multi-methods approach to knowledge production, which uses some combination of the previous frameworks. In this case, knowledges are plural, and with a diversity of perspectives, we can better approach a knowledge that matches the complexity and diversity of being. And this seeks insight more than convergence. So the thing is, what I observed from the presentations at the conference is that nearly across the board, people agree that it's not enough to see these plants as simply their chemical components. They have their own agency and are entwined with indigenous traditions as well. Yet researchers don't have good precedents for cross-cultural, interspecies, intercosmic collaboration in producing knowledge. Little framework for engaging with plant agencies. Even us researchers who call for something different and reference the inspirited nature of these plants are often still stuck in our disciplinary methods that reproduce old paradigms and old hierarchies. I found that particularly less established researchers working in psychotherapeutic or medical disciplines were less likely to even mention plant spirits. Perhaps it's because it's risky to talk about them unless speaking about someone else's beliefs. Researchers struggle with their own subjectivities and how to incorporate our subjective experiences into our knowledge production. This is a challenge that Bia, for example, has spoken of before, and it's so tricky because it requires a paradigm shift in how we're creating knowledge and challenges our deeply ingrained human exceptionalism. Indigenous sciences, including, but not limited to the shamanic methods I mentioned earlier, do a better job of engaging with plant spirits and have precedents for producing knowledge in collaboration with these plants. However, the engagement between indigenous knowledges and Western researchers has a long record of unequal power relations, exclusion, and appropriation. Indigenous sciences are valid and valuable knowledge production practices. Rather than relegating them as spiritual beliefs, can we explore what an indigenous science really looks like, give credit to existing formalized and systematic ways of knowing, and also recognize intellectual property? We can turn to theories and methods developed by Indigenous researchers and scholars, including Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Kim Tallbear, Sonia Adelaide, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, and Sean Wilson, among many others. These perspectives are invaluable to the conversation on decolonization and democratization of knowledge, for their deep and embodied insight into how to weave together different knowledges and knowledge communities without subsuming one into the other, but allowing them to be sovereign, collaborative, and non-hierarchically organized. These scholars are also working on developing research methods that are appropriate within Indigenous frameworks. As Wilson urges, we need our methods and analyses to be accountable to the relationships they create. Indigenous knowledge systems are quite heterogeneous, and yet perhaps their greatest commonality and the only thing that really allows them to be grouped together is that they have been excluded from mainstream knowledge systems and denied credibility or validity based on their identity or practices. That's what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. Indigenous knowledges have been scrutinized for their purported level of authenticity, which is often defined by distance from science, yet they're simultaneously subjected to scientific verification. But who really has the authority to decide what exists or what qualifies as truth? One of the things that's historically been used to exclude Indigenous knowledges from scientific knowledge is the perceived lack of universality, mobility, or ability to disseminate, and they're marked as local and contextual. In my understanding, these different epistemological standards come down to how comfortable we are with intimacy. Mobility and intimacy can be seen as two different measures for epistemic authority. But is there a trade-off between the two? Although they're often treated this way, I think it's a false binary, and I propose that the two are more aptly described as different axes of epistemic authority. Academic research is often granted authority based on universality and mobility of knowledge dissemination, but oftentimes lacks intimacy and relation, while epistemic authority for Indigenous knowledges is often linked to intimacy, integrity, familiarity, and perceptiveness of the knower. Perhaps collaborative methods can bring the two closer together. With ayahuasca, we see an Indigenous technology becoming more mobilized, and with this we see decontextualization and recontextualization. But there are remaining problems, I think highlighted by what Benki Piako said somewhat sarcastically, I think, at the conference. Perhaps through science, we will say once and for all whether ayahuasca is sacred or is intoxicating. We need to address power imbalances between researchers and Indigenous communities. And these power relations are reinscribed when one form of knowledge is used to validate another, like when science validates indigenous knowledge. And we need part of this conversation to be about intellectual property, but intellectual property is not the only property that's at stake, because any of these conversations about indigenous rights need to also be about territory, land, property, and these issues are also entwined with the interests of medicinal plants as well. So what would multi-species collaborative knowledge production really look like? I think we need to start thinking in terms of ecologies of knowing that incorporate different knowledge-making practices and how we can braid these knowledges together. Within ecologies of knowing, we build common understanding, not necessarily a common knowledge set. Academia needs to take into account multiple dimensions of knowledge, and failure to speak about or engage with multiple knowledge implies complicity in creating marginalization. For the case of ayahuasca and other teacher plants, I'd like to reframe ceremonies as trans-species communication events and diets as knowledge production practices. Likewise, I'd like to explore how research can be ceremony, a type of academic ritual that also involves trans-species communication. Robin Wall Kimmerer reframes ecological experiments as a way of posing questions to plants and listening for their answers. In fact, right now we're taking part in a different type of academic ritual. I think viewing academic practices as rituals can be useful in situating them in their own cultural context versus universalizing them. I think it's important to understand how the rituals we're performing reproduce hierarchies and social structures. And specifically, I've been addressing the relationship between researcher and researched as subject and object relationship. I suggest that by focusing research as a ritual boundary crossing, there's a potential for an emancipatory move from a research system that's linked to a long and violent history of imperialism and colonialism. If we approach our research rituals and our boundary crossings with the ethical stance of healing, we might bring ourselves into relationship in a felt sense within a multi-species ecology of other selves. Listening to plants is a practice that I'm only a beginner at, so I'm not here to teach you how. There are many others who can. I am, however, imploring you to listen, because we can't do this alone. It's time we start figuring out how to collaborate with intelligences beyond the human, because this collaboration is going to be necessary. And these teacher plants, ayahuasca and chacruna and others, are considered master plants precisely because of their abilities to facilitate trans-species communication. To use these plants for human spiritual needs while ignoring the spirit of the plants themselves is not honoring proper laws of reciprocity. Listening is an embodied practice, and it again requires humility, a word that shares its root with human and comes from humus, the earth, reminding us that we're all earthly beings. Thank you.